Hi, I'm Renee Jones and I work in events and media here at ASPI, which means that I get to work with some of the best strategic minds getting around. So every now and then I like to take an opportunity to sit down and ask ASPI a few questions. So today I'm joined by Dr. Malcolm Davis, who is a Senior Analyst in our Defence Strategy and Capability Program. Thanks for being here today, Malcolm.
My pleasure.
So I wanted to sit down and talk to you about space, because my knowledge about space kind of begins and ends with my primary school knowledge and films. And I know that you work on space and research that area from a strategic point of view, and I don't really know what that means. So I just wanted to ask, what exactly is it that you do here at ASPI when you're researching space?
When I look at space, I'm looking primarily at space policy and space capabilities. Space policy is how we use space for military and national security purposes. And this is particularly relevant for Australia because Australia is just starting to get into this area in terms of developing its own space capabilities. We're starting to have a debate nationally about developing a space agency. And it's generally looking at how Australia could use space to further its own defence and national security purposes. Space capabilities, of course, is the technology. It's satellites, it's rockets, it's all the systems that we need to be able to use space for military purposes.
So we don't have our own NASA equivalent. We're trying to develop a space agency. So how far behind are we in terms of space policy?
Well, we're out of all the countries in the world, there is only two that don't have a space agency. Australia is one.
What's the other country?
I think it's one of the South American countries. But we have basically let this founder virtually since the 1950s, when you had the European Launcher Development Organisation, ELDO, in here with the British and the French testing rockets. There was discussions then about getting a space capability, but government has just been content to let the Americans provide space capabilities for us ever since then. We're now starting to realise that space as an area is changing. There's this term called Space 2.0, which basically is commercial space using low-cost systems that are much cheaper than traditional large billion-dollar satellites. Reusable rocket technology is starting to appear with companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin using those. On the horizon, you've got airborne launch capabilities, which will drive the cost down even further. So the whole point of Space 2.0 is to drive the cost down to get into space and use space, and thus open it up for a broader range of customers. And Australia can take advantage of this. For the first time, we can start building satellites at a very low cost, and we can even look at launching them ourselves. And so suddenly the whole issue of space and what we do with it and the need for a space agency to coordinate all this becomes really important, because suddenly we can become a player, whereas before we weren't a player.
So does anyone really own space? How does it work with private industry and governments? Do they work together, or is it just a race to whoever gets there first?
Space is a global commons in the sense that no one owns space per se. There's a treaty that was signed in 1967 called the Outer Space Treaty, which says that you can't claim ownership of the moon and other celestial bodies. Having said that, the Obama administration in 2015 signed the Space Act, which basically says that a commercial company, if it can access resources on the moon or an asteroid, can claim ownership of those resources and thus make profit from it. So we're starting to edge away from this notion that space can't be claimed. And we're starting, I think, to move towards the point whereby not only commercial companies might compete with one another, but states might start competing. So in the 2020s, you might see, for example, the US, China, and Japan and India all in a new race for the moon to claim lunar resources, lunar-based resources, or resources in the region around the moon. And that's a really interesting development, because you will have commercial companies acting as front ends for states and competing with one another. And that generates a greater degree of geopolitical competition in space over resources, over control of orbits, over access to the moon and other bodies. And so we're entering a really interesting period.
So we could be looking at a potential war over space resources.
I think you could see the potential for competition in space and developing that into competition going to conflict at some point. But the other aspect of that, of course, is that, excuse me, that you're starting to see countries like China and Russia developing counter-space capabilities, in other words, space weapons designed to destroy our satellites or disable our satellites. And so we're going to have to respond to that challenge. We didn't respond during the Obama administration because we had this policy of what's known as strategic restraint, where we tried to focus on dissuasion and deterrence, but that hasn't stopped the Chinese and the Russians from developing these space weapons capabilities. So the Trump administration is going to have to start thinking about how they respond to that challenge. Or if they don't, then in a war, you would see China and Russia rapidly taking out our space capabilities. And without those space capabilities, we can't fight war in the manner that we're used to in terms of precision, speed, minimal loss of life, minimal risk. So it's a really important area. You've got this competition on two levels. You've got it at the state level in terms of development of these space capabilities, these counter-space capabilities. And in the bigger picture, you have this commercial competition for resources that could extend into competition and conflict in the future.
Almost like a Star Wars, if you will.
She points the cup appropriately.
I'm sorry, I had to. So the focus is actually on the moon. I thought it was a large part of focus was getting to Mars first.
There's a real debate over that too. There was headlines today with Elon Musk, the head of SpaceX, saying that we need to focus on a lunar base rather than going straight to Mars. I think there's a recognition that getting to Mars is a very difficult, very expensive and very risky proposition. Going back to the moon is far less risky, far less costly. We can do an awful lot on the moon and around the moon in this region called cislunar space. We can develop the infrastructure that would enable us to have a permanent and expanding human presence off Earth, on the moon and around it. And that is a pretty ambitious goal. That is a pretty important aspect to be able to transition towards becoming a spacefaring species. And Mars is still going to be there. If we delay Mars by 20 years, the technology will be better, it will be cheaper, safer, and maybe we can do Mars more effectively later if we go to the moon first. So I think there's a strong case to be made to go back to the moon first rather than try to push on to Mars.
So for Australia, what do we need to be doing in the immediate 5, 10, 15 years in terms of space policy?
I think in terms of space policy, the first step is a space agency. We do need a space agency to coordinate national efforts and to coordinate government and commercial activities. We need to encourage industry in Australia to develop our own space industry. We can do that now with Space 2.0 technologies like CubeSats and so forth, where we're starting to see CubeSats being built in Australia. University of New South Wales is building their own CubeSats, and they've launched one and they're going to launch another couple in the next few months. So we need to encourage space industry, and we need to think at the policy level of how we utilise Australian space capabilities in terms of satellites and launch systems to support defence and national security. So rather than completely relying on the Americans, we complement American capabilities with Australian capabilities. We talk to the Americans about how they can use our space capabilities to help them in a burden-sharing role. And we talked also to our partners in the region, to Japan, to Singapore, to Indonesia, to India, to see could we develop multilateral space consortiums whereby we're working together in space as a regional entity rather than just single state entities.
Okay, so my last question is probably the most important. What is your favourite movie about space?
See, that's very difficult because space movies are my bread and butter. I love them. I'd say that probably the most important one is 2001: A Space Odyssey.
A classic.
It is the one that, as a young child, influenced my interest in space. My parents took me to see it, and there's the sequence where the shuttle was going up to the space station with the Blue Danube music by Strauss, and I looked at that and I thought, I want to do that. I want to be in that area when I grow up. And well, I'm not flying a shuttle, but I'm talking about space in my daily business. So 2001: A Space Odyssey is really important in my development professionally. I think obviously Star Wars. Who doesn't like Star Wars? I think out of the most recent ones, I would have to say Gravity and The Martian are the best. I didn't like Interstellar. That turned me off completely.
I liked it for the most part, but then I thought it fell apart in the third act a little bit.
Whereas Gravity was excellent because even though it showed the so-called Kessler effect of multiple collisions, building up in a cascade, it showed that inaccurately in the sense that it was sped up in terms of timeline. The actual way they showed moving about in spacesuits, in an extra vehicle activity, an EVA, was really well done. And The Martian was great because it was just showed the challenges of living on Mars and the challenges of really long-range space operations, and how do you rescue an astronaut from Mars that's millions and millions of miles from Earth. So The Martian, Gravity, Star Wars, of course, and there's many others, but 2001: A Space Odyssey is probably the most important to me.
Great. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. Thanks so much for joining me today, Malcolm. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask ASPI, get in touch via Twitter at ASPI_org.